You are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt är livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Lisa Åsimäki. I'm welcoming Professor Vincent Hurley, who is a university lecturer from Macquarie University in Australia, whose specialization is on contemporary role of the police and policing within criminological theories. So welcome to the podcast, Vincent, and you are well?
Yeah, thanks very much, Lisa. Yeah, I'm excellent down here. It's it's a beautiful day.
Great.
Thanks for the invitation.
You are so welcome. Now, you have such a fascinating background. So can you start off by providing a brief background to who is Vince Hurley and what attracted you to choosing to work as a police officer some 20 and more years ago?
So I was in the New South Wales Police for 29 years. I joined in 1981 and left in 2010 after a couple of serious workplace accidents which happened very close together. So I did general duties or street policing in Sydney's outer western suburbs, which is a very low socioeconomic area, a high degree of illiteracy, second and third generation unemployed. So I worked out there for about 4 years. I then decided after that to go into the detectives. So it took a number of years to be trained, and I still remained in that area as a detective investigating local domestic homicides, local drug trafficking, arson, local organised crime. I then moved into an organised crime unit in Sydney, particularly or specialising in child mistreatment, as they called it at the time. So now it would be sex crimes against children, generally between the age of 24 months old up to about 12 years old.
Gosh.
And I did that for a number of And I did that for a number of years, and then I became a police hostage negotiator. Mm-hmm. So I went to a lot of sieges, mainly as a result of family law court rulings that had gone against men who took members of their family hostage. That was most common, and certainly later on in that section, we commenced doing a lot of suicide intervention. So it's no longer called hostage negotiations; it's just called a negotiator. So a lot of suicide intervention for people who wanted to jump off cliffs. And I've been on top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I had been quite a few times. So I did that for quite a few years. And then I was seconded into what would be known as your equivalent of your Swedish Premier or the Prime Minister's Department, where we looked at domestic violence policies around Australia, but specifically in New South Wales, to work out how police could better deal with victims and bring the offender to court with the least amount of trauma on victims. So we looked at domestic violence policies and procedures for the New South Wales Police, which has about a membership of about 25,000 police or thereabouts.
Gosh.
So yeah, that's primarily my career in essence. Yeah.
So in what way, I mean, that would have had an impact on yourself as a person? Yeah, look,
to be honest, Lisa, at the time it probably didn't have that much of an impact because I was single, I wasn't married. Certainly the always investigating the pit of humanity and the depravity of society did take its toll, but it wasn't like now. I'm a father now and I have 4 teenage children. It probably took on a different perspective had I had been married, particularly within the child mistreatment unit. So I was lucky at the time that I didn't have that, emotional connection to children, whilst I was very compassionate and understanding and, I enjoyed locking up offenders. It didn't have that same experience of having been a parent at that time. So I was pretty fortunate in that respect.
So thinking back then or thinking about now, I'm sure there must be young men and women who might be aspiring to work or careers in the police force. What advice would you have for these young people?
Look, it's a fantastic career. It's every day is varied. It's really interesting. Many people think that it's a dangerous job, and it can be at point, but it's not as if in Australia, for that matter, or I've imagined in Sweden, that the police are just tossed in at the deep end and left to fend for themselves. They're given guidance, as they start in their career. But I think many people say, they want to do some good for society. And ironically, I think that whilst that is true, you're probably doing a sort of good, but it's not really recognised as good. So you're arresting offenders, but that's probably not a way that people perceive it to be. I think sometimes people perceive it to be rescuing children or women or individuals from a certain situation, which you are, but most of the police work is about locking up baddies. Yeah. So it has a bit of a romantic notion about it, I think.
And there is also the other side, which is a question I thought of asking you, is do you believe that there is a time when the use of violence is lawful or legitimate?
Yeah, look, I think there is. That's why there's defences to homicide, for example, in self-defence. So there are situations where violence is acceptable. And if I just had to reflect upon policing just for a moment, policing exists in an environment of violence. So people call the police because there is violence, or police arrive and violence is happening. And sometimes when they leave, violence occurs. So policing exists in an environment of violence. If you took the Army, Air Force and Navy, their work, at least in Australia, doesn't exist in a daily environment of violence. When they go on tour or deployed, it is, but it's not every day. So even if you compared it to the armed forces, violence is an accepted part of policing. And even, Lisa, even when it's police use violence against another person for a lawful arrest, it looks ugly.
Yes.
It looks ugly. Even if it's justified, it looks, it doesn't look good. So coming back to the question about, using violence, yes, violence is a necessary part of policing to uphold social behaviour and social norms. But if you looked at women of domestic violence, if you look at the data in Australia, for example, there are women who are being arrested for domestic violence, but of course a number of them have done it in self-defence, or they have done it because over the decades they have been ground down by the male and it's their last resort, like that they've snapped.
Yeah.
So, that is totally understandable. And tragically then they are put before the court to answer for their actions. And you would hope, in the cases that I've been in, that the court takes in, or the jury at least, take in the whole history of the event rather than that just single isolated, 5 minutes.
I'm just thinking about some, I'm not sure what the entry requirements to become a police officer. I'm sure you would be kind of checked out, what kind of person you are. Are you prone for violence? What's your mental stability? You know what I mean? There's a lot of people, and I understand here in Sweden it's quite rigorous requirements to even get past to become a police officer, even if there is enormous amount of we want to recruit new police officers continuously, but there are those requirements of what sort of person is a police officer? How quickly am I prone to violence? Do you know what I mean? Would that the same thing be in Australia, or?
Yeah, no, it's probably slightly different. I've always taken an interest in Nordic countries' policing, and I would say, in contrast to Australian policing, and there's 8 different police agencies in Australia, one for each state and territory, and then one nationally. But when I look at the Nordic ones, there are years ahead insofar as recruit training and education around what the social expectations of the police and the social nuances around, how society works, and about domestic violence and victims and things like that. New South Wales or other Australian states don't have that same degree or depth of training that they do in the Nordic countries. So when New South Wales police recruit individuals, they recruited obviously from the community, so they reflect community values. And tragically, and this is probably no different from many other policing agencies around the world, that sometimes they can be racist, sometimes they can be homophobic, sometimes they can be misogynistic. But generally speaking, there is no, unlike at home where you are, there is no in-depth psychological profiling or analysis to see if an individual is suited to the police. It's when they get in there that if they want to go into specific areas or sections, like as a hostage negotiator, you have to do a lot of psychological analysis on me to see if I was suitable. But it's not like at home where you are, where there is really rigorous analysis of the individual before they go in, which in many ways has historically, for New South Wales and other state and territory police, has allowed, say, corruption to permeate the organisations. So that upfront analysis isn't as rigid or certainly in depth as it is in the Nordic countries.
Now, can you share your decision then to leave as a police officer to study criminology? Why did you choose criminology?
I actually left because I had a couple of serious workplace accidents, and I didn't particularly want to leave, but I didn't have much of a choice under the law or the legislation in which I joined the police back in the early 1980s. It said in the legislation that there was no provision at that time for occupational health and safety for people being retrained in the police if they got injured. So I fell off a 2-story building onto a slab of concrete. Gosh. And there's not much giving a slab of concrete.
No bounds.
So I got bashed around fairly badly, and I was off work for probably the best part of 8 months. And then the organisation said, Vince, your time is up. So it's time to leave, much to my disappointment. So I left. But I was fortunate enough in the police to have already gained a degree in psychology and criminology, because I found studying, when I was in the police, most people think it's fairly cut and dry from looking from the outside in. Someone's committed a crime, so you arrest them, as you do. But the more you know about crime and criminology and an individual's thinking, it's not as clear cut as most people think it is. There's the way that people are raised. For example, you might have a 7-year-old boy or girl, but we'll use a male as an example, who witnesses or lives in an environment of domestic violence, and they're 5 or they're 7 years of age, but they don't understand at the time. They are fearful, but they don't understand at the time how that develops their personality. They witness it, they grow up with it, they see it as acceptable, but when they're young, they don't have the developmental maturity to understand that the behaviour that they later exhibit is going to lead them into a life of violence or crime. And if you have, say, for example, a 5-year-old boy or 7-year-old boy who then starts exhibiting that behaviour on his younger sister, then he doesn't necessarily know that that behaviour is wrong because, as I said, he doesn't have the psychological development to understand what he's doing is wrong. So it's easy at the end of their adult life or their teenage life to say, well, they should have known better, and they should. Yeah. There's no doubt about that. But the underlying premise of their behaviour is the environment in which they are raised, and in that environment, they don't know when they're young why they're doing it and what the difference is between right and wrong. So I found interesting that aspect of criminology and policing. When we talk about criminology, as you might know, when my students ask me what is criminology, I say if you have 3 glasses of a different chemical, and you had one glass that was called, society. So everyone in society, regardless of religion, race, culture, regardless of education, regardless of, socioeconomic status, and you poured that into a glass. And another chemical you poured into that glass, and that chemical was called crime. So everything from firearms trafficking to homicide to assaults to cybercrime to the dark net, and you poured that into the glass. And then your third glass was a combination of police, the courts and prisons, and you poured that in. That chemical reaction is criminology. So criminology is just a general, like a term that they use for takeaway. Like I like takeaway. Well, that could be, that could be French, it could be Vietnamese, it could be Italian, it could be anything. So it's that chemical reaction which I really found interesting about, the relationship between why the laws are made, why people break the laws, and the implications on a social level.
Beautifully explained, because when I have questions about the young male child, and particularly their background, which you just kind of touched on, and also their culture. But I'm also want to include schooling to the development of violent and aggressive male identities. Would you which role would you say has the major role in shaping this violent, aggressive male identity?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple of answers or points to that. When we are trying to educate our boys not to participate in violence, either intentionally or without them thinking, I find certainly in Australia the school curriculum is full of cyber, how to deal with cyberbullying, how to deal with anger management issues, how to deal with violence at school. And often the last thing to get to get taught as your basic maths and English. And the school curriculum within Australia, at least, is crowded so much with these social problems that it's not always possible to get through to the children about a specific issue, because society wants or hopes that this education of the children will touch on all these social problems, but that's just not possible, because that is not really the function of school. It has evolved into that, but basically education is about maths and English and comprehension, which, as I said, sometimes get pushed to the side because of taking drugs is bad, or if you're going to take drugs, be wise about it and things like that. So the schooling and trying to shape the male thinking around violence is sort of crowded in amongst a whole range of other issues. And teachers, and my brother's a high school teacher, I feel sorry for the teachers here in Australia, because there's such a shortage of them because of the pressures put upon them to try and resolve social or society issues. So if a child is exhibiting aggressive behaviour at school, then really it's either up to the school counsellor or the teacher, but the teacher's got 25 to 30 children in their class, which is an average class in Australia. So their time, they have to split their time around, 25 to 30 children. So how do they do that successfully? School is the only place where, at least in Australia, where you can get a whole cohort of children of different ages from 5 when they generally start school to 18, but we'll talk about primary school up until about 8 to 10, between 5 and 10. It's the only time or place in society where you can get them all together to discuss these things. And some of them don't even want to be there. So even though they're collectively together and the curriculum may spell out about anger management or how to deal with your peers, some students don't want to be there. Some have got, attention disorder problems. Some might have other mental health issues going on, or some might be coming from domestic violence backgrounds. So, I think there's an unfortunate over-reliance on schools to try and fix social issues, but I just don't see how, in many ways, school can, or education of men is going to be that successful, given how curriculum is so crowded, certainly within Australia. In addition to that, even if they are identified as being, an anger management type problem, the cost and trying to find services outside of the education system are really expensive in Australia. Like, you're looking at $200 Australian dollars at least an hour for a psychologist, and then there's a massive wait time to get into that. Yeah. So based on my policing experience, those that come from those areas I spoke about earlier, the Sydney's outer western suburbs with high illiteracy skills and high unemployment and second and third generation unemployed, they don't have the financial ability to be able to go and pay that amount of money for an hour. They just don't have it. So they're left lingering in society with this unchecked behaviour, in contrast to other more affluent parts of Sydney, like near Bondi Beach, for example, where people could easily afford that amount of money to take their children to a psychologist to be able to manage that behaviour.
Whose role is it to support them? Is it the police?
Yeah, I think they do have in Australia police liaison officers that work within schools. For sure, they have that, and that's part of their role. It is part of their education that the police come in and talk to them on a fairly regular basis. But again, because of the geography, or because of the different socioeconomic levels within Australia, some children are just simply not interested in talking to the police because they only see the police, or fearing the police, because the police go around and arrest dad for domestic violence or for drugs or whatever the case may be. So that's a problem. That's one problem. Sorry, Lisa, I've lost my train of thought. What was the other part of the question?
So the other part of the question is, so I'm thinking about the consequences for the society. I mean, I'm going to give you an example of what is happening here in Sweden, and maybe that will also help with your answer. But we have a situation here in Sweden where very young children are recruited to commit crimes, whether relating to the sale of narcotics or to shooting someone. And my kind of thinking is there a way of preventing this? And when I'm talking about these children, who are these young people or these kids? And I'm talking about 15 and under. because of the laws in Sweden are pretty generous for young children, that it's not, when they commit heinous crimes, there is a lot of leeway for them. But there is now talks about we're going to make it harder for children to be recruited, because the older ones in the networks, etc., they're recruiting them. And so because the younger they are, the less likely they are to be incarcerated in adult jails. Now, and these are areas where we have, the lot of people without not from Swedish background. So my question is there a way of preventing this, or is this just something that we're kind of losing control over?
I think there's two answers to that. First of all, children are very malleable. Children, as I said earlier, I have 4 teenage children, so they're very malleable when they're young. So if you tell them something and you coerce them into doing something when they're young, then they don't necessarily see that being wrong, because they want to be endeared to you. So when we're talking about young children, and certainly not the age of 15, that's for sure, but when children generally want to please individuals, so manipulating them into, say, being part of drug trafficking, or firearms trafficking, or drive-by shootings, or arsons, or things like that. I don't think it's that hard to manipulate a child into that, because it would be sold to the child as something that is exciting, something that you do this and I'll give you a tangible reward, yes, or I'll be very proud of you if you go ahead and do this. But that child, I would suspect, would already be within an environment of criminality. I don't think most children, the average person or the average child, whatever that may be, would be an individual that would be exposed to that type of environment. I also think that Australia is a very multicultural country. I think that there are elements within Australia that appear to be, and people might say this is racist, but I'm looking at my experience in the police, that would be more predisposed to certain types of crime. So, for example, in the past, the police have had what they call the Middle Eastern organised crime gang. So naturally, that name dictates that the police are focused on the Middle Eastern organised crime. We've had Asian task forces in the past, which focus on the Asian community. Now, once that particular crime, whether it be drug trafficking or whether it be drive-by shootings, has been de-escalated or solved, then that task force or that police unit is disbanded. But there will always be an element of, like, outlaw motorcycle gangs are a big problem in Australia. So there is an outlaw motorcycle gang task force. Now, people don't say that's racist, but it is targeting a certain socio-economic group. Yes. But if you were to say that, they come from, I don't know, some mythical country, and you called it, the mythical country motorcycle gang, people would say that you're being racist. But it's not necessarily racist in my view. All the police are doing are trying to target a specific type of crime that people have, for whatever reason, gravitated towards and seen that as being acceptable. And if that means that, people from the South Pole, for example, are gravitated towards drive-by shootings, then that is not necessarily the fault or the branding of the police. It's the fact that those people are attracted to that particular crime at that point in time for whatever reason. So there have been, and there still is, police units throughout Australia that are orientated towards a specific crime type, which engender specific individuals and races into that particular sphere of criminality. So I think that when we're talking about young children, if they are already in that particular, socioeconomic culture or that culture, then, they remain in that culture. And some cultures, let's be honest, are very insular. Even in Australia, which we have a very multicultural society, some individuals and some cultures, are insular. Even the white Anglo-Saxon male culture or female culture here is very insular. Absolutely. I live in a very insular part of 2 hours inland from Sydney, which is predominantly 95%, white Caucasians. So, of course, my children are going to grow up in that environment.
Yep.
So I think that and there is always a dilemma between how the courts deal with a juvenile. And I can honestly say, in my time in the 30 years or thereabouts in the police, and even since, I always hold the view that the juvenile courts, as we call them here, are just far too lenient on children. Because I think, having been in the police, for me, jails are there for a reason. They're there because people are being recalcitrant and they don't learn their lesson, so they need to go to jail. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that all children in particular should go to jail, but I think that it used to irk me that there were, people would be the victims of crime and the children would get off what appeared to be, for me at least, scot-free. And I think, how can that be? What about the victim of the crime? What about them? And yes, some kids used to play the system. Some were genuine and they were remorseful and they're sorry. And I also sometimes think the role of the media do a really good job in amplifying all the badness in society. Now, the media have a role to play because they bring our attention to crime issues, they bring our attention to trends in crime, but I also think that they do have a degree to play in ensuring that there is a fair representation of crime, but not only the crime, of the police and police behaviour for that matter as well. But definitely with, and I'm just using this as an example, this war in Syria or the war in the Middle East and the refugee movement around the world, whether they be economic refugees coming to Australia from around India or Bangladesh, they're coming here because of a variety of reasons. And of course, they're going to gravitate to those that live in the communities that align with their views.
Yes.
So that goes to make the policing a lot more difficult because, they are insular communities because that's where they come from. That's where they feel comfortable with.
Of course. Yes, and this is such a huge area, but we're going to jump to another area. But before we do, I want you, if you could talk about the 6 motivators to commit crime.
Oh, well, now, where did you hear that?
When did I? Oh, look, I check you out because, believe me, I've gone through your stuff and I'm saying, I'm going to ask him to be part of the podcast because you got I love your framework, if you like, if you want to call it a framework, I will call it a framework. But look, it's going to be a long podcast, but I hope you don't mind because this is really important to understand. So, would you be happy to talk about?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Explain.
So, explain. I'm being held to account even 30,000 kilometres away. So there are 6 motivating reasons why people commit crime. And if you look at and you think about crime through the centuries and crime in the future, I find it hard to understand how these 6 motivating reasons can be drifted away or discounted. So the first one is lust, not necessarily in any particular order, but lust. So why do people commit crime? They commit crime because of lust, and some of these cross over. So it could be a crime of rape, which is the first thing that comes to mind, or it could be a crime of, well, if I can't have you, no one else is going to have you. So the crime of lust is one. Second one is anger. So, and I give this example in class. So with my 4 teenage children, when they were growing up, and kids say this a lot, when one of the siblings does something, they'll say, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you. So people commit crime because of anger. So they fly into, rage. And the woman, or the example I gave earlier about the woman who's pushed right to breaking point in domestic violence is an example of anger. She just pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and she's reached her limit. So she snapped, for want of a better phrase. So people commit crime for lust and anger. People commit crime also for revenge, and this is where anger and revenge can cross over. So revenge could be on a spouse for domestic violence, but we see a lot of revenge taking place as a result of organised crime, drive-by shootings, but particularly with outlaw motorcycle gangs, where the Hells Angels just simply might hate the Comancheros or Bandidos, not for any other reason other than they just hate them. They may not have caused any crime against them, but they just simply hate them. So hate is another one. Ego, and I love using this example. So people commit crime because they think they're better than anyone else. And the best example I can come up with is Donald Trump. So he's got the world's biggest ego. And the way he treats women and what he said about women just is mind-boggling. And it doesn't even seem to worry him. He seems to have this right, he believes, to treat women as some type of, just sexual vessel or object for his own pleasure based on his ego. And I think he is. And when I say this to the kids in class, they all go, oh, my God, the penny drops, and go, yes, we understand about ego. So we've got lust and we've got anger, we've got revenge, ego. One is excitement. And excitement about people committing crime is primarily around arson, where they get some type of sexual gratification to look at their handiwork. And what I mean by that is that they can commit the crime of arson, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, they'll be in the background watching their handiwork. They're watching a house or a bush go up in flames, and they'll look at all the excitement of all the trucks arriving, or fire trucks arriving to put it all out, and all the smoke and the haze and people running around in panic. So again, the excitement can cross over sometimes into, revenge. There was a murder here a few years ago where 12 people died in a nursing home fire, and the bloke lit it as a result of excitement, but also as a revenge against his employer. So the other one is excitement. And the other one is a bit of an outlier. It's like political ideology. So that would be, your caliphate, your ISIS, individuals like that. And what sets this apart when we're talking about ideology, or people who are wedded to an idea, is that their crime generally is against the state. So when I mean the state, the government. What sets it apart is that they don't specifically go to harm a single individual like those other crimes. They want the state to be punished for what they believe is wrong. It just so happens that the members of the public are caught up in that crime. So that's what separates, political ideology. And that's why, as a former hostage negotiator, it was always hard, and we did in plenty of scenarios, but I never negotiated with a genuine terrorist. But based on case studies and scenarios when we were doing our training coming up to the Sydney Olympics in 2000, was that that is why it's so hard to negotiate with someone who has a political ideology. It could be the IRA, for example, in contrast to a normal hostage taker, or even a suicide intervention.
What I get that, the ideological perspective. Now, when we think about the 6 motivators, what role does mental health issues have?
Oh, wow. So when I was on Q&A, the Australian program of Q&A on the ABC, which is where you first would have seen my
Yes.
what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I tore the strips off the two politicians.
Brilliant.
Thank you. They deserved it too. I've just lost my train of thought again.
Sorry. So what does mental health play in the role of the motive when you motivate or commit crimes?
Yeah. So when we speak about mental health, and as I said on the program, it's related to every aspect of our lives, but particularly when we're talking about domestic violence or gambling addiction or drugs and alcohol. And mental health is one of the four pillars that impacts upon everyone's life. I think the World Health Organization said in 2022 that in the Western world, 1 in every 7 people will suffer some type of mental health episode in their life. Now, that's a staggering figure when you think about that. But the thing with mental health is that, as I explained to my students, is that you couldn't necessarily tell if Vince Hurley, for example, had a mental health issue, because externally he seemed quite normal. That Vince Hurley, who may or may not have a mental health issue, doesn't necessarily exhibit those signs, but it's certainly when he's under pressure or he's going through an undiagnosed crisis, that will cloud his judgment. And that means that in Vince Hurley's mind, he's probably not doing anything wrong at all. But of course, to the outside world, even if the police come and speak to Vince Hurley, doesn't mean Vince Hurley actually comprehends what the police are saying, because in his mind, Vince Hurley's mind, it's all distorted. They don't see the message or they don't hear the message from the police. So with mental health, they could have 2 mental health or 3 mental health issues. And what really compounds the issue of mental health is that, the police or if a victim is part or been assaulted as a result of a mental health episode, they don't know, the victim, if the mental health individual has taken all their medication or some of their medication, or they've missed a day and they've doubled up, or they don't know if the psychiatrists have actually got the mixture of medication spot on, because they don't get it right the first time. Then if you add drugs into that, are they taking cannabis? Are they taking amphetamines? And then on top of that, are they, alcohol dependent? And what's the pharmacological reaction or chemical reaction in the brain of, the medication, the alcohol, and the illicit drugs? So mental health is massive. And then on top of that, you got, in Australia at least, a cost of living which is exceptionally high at the moment, and people are losing their jobs. And then if you add it into that mix, what we were talking about earlier, about the different cultural backgrounds of individuals who may have come from war-torn countries suffering post-traumatic stress, it's just a cocktail for disaster. So I know, I used to be quite cynical about people claiming, mental health as a defence against crime. And yes, it has its place. But I also think, without being too harsh, that people need to be held accountable for their actions. I think sometimes that the mental health excuse is just that, an excuse. And once it gets to court, of course, it's out of the police hands or the prosecutor's hands. It's up to the court to make that decision. But there is no doubt mental health seems to be playing an increasing part or role in people committing crime, or perhaps it's just now being more recognised than what it was.
Mm-hmm. And that brings me to the question about, why do you think that violence against women and killing women has escalated?
That is an excellent question. Over the last 20 years, domestic violence homicide in Australia has remained relatively stable. And when I mean stable, it's not that many. It seems to be a lot, and it's never acceptable any amount. But in contrast to previous years, it has been, I just can't remember the figures, but I'll recall them in a minute. But certainly this year, there's been about 54 deaths, or 1 in every 4 days, of females being murdered as a result of domestic violence.
Yes.
no one knows at the moment why that is. Is it because of the pressure of the cost of living that has impacted in Australia in the last 18 months? Is it a legacy or leftover something from COVID? Now, I know COVID's blamed for altering a lot of things in the world, but I don't know if that could be blamed on domestic violence, because if that was the case, then you would have seen more domestic violence, homicides during COVID when they were living in closer proximity, in contrast to outside. So I don't necessarily think COVID is a driving factor. I wish I honestly knew the answer to that, because when I've gone through the coroner's report, and I've read over 1,000 coronial inquiries in Australia over the last 12 years, so far, other than mental health, drug and alcohol addiction, gambling addiction, and domestic violence, those are the four common elements. But why there has been a massive spike in our terms in domestic violence for women, I don't know. Is it because that the boys now have been through school, and there was that gap where there was no attention paid to them through education about anger management, and now they've come out at this end of their life. Now, if you compared that to the school children going through now, just putting aside the fact how crowded the curriculum is, would those individuals going through school now in 10 years' time exhibit the same behaviour because, domestic violence has been addressed? I don't know, but there certainly has been more social awareness of domestic violence, but that doesn't account for why. I'm sure, other people who are far more knowledgeable than me in this area might have an explanation as to why that is the case, but I honestly don't know. And and I wish I knew the answer. I don't know.
You gave a brilliant dressing down of politicians in the Q&A program. Can you talk about why you are specifically critical of politicians not doing enough about violence against women?
Yep, because it's not a re-election issue. That is so cynical to say. So politicians, so when I worked in what would be the equivalent of the Swedish government, when I was on secondment to what was equivalent to the Prime Minister's office in Sweden, when I was in Sydney, I distinctly remember this example to this day. I was sitting around the table with the minister in charge. There was two other police and I. We were developing domestic violence policy, or new domestic violence policy for New South Wales Police. We were sitting around a table. We had the minister in charge of the police there, and we presented, I can't even remember what the example was, we presented an idea about how to reduce domestic violence. Two other ministers walked into his office in the same side of politics and said, what are you doing? And David Campbell, who was the minister at the time, said, we're talking about X, Y, and Z. And one of the politicians took the pieces of paper that we had, and he goes, this is great policy, but is it good politics? And I could not believe it.
Okay.
I was absolutely gobsmacked to think that, and this is decades ago, that they had no moral compass other than their own political survival to put the people of Australia below politics. I was just, and I've never forgotten that example, and that is what I believe, even to this day, to be true, that generally speaking, not all, but generally speaking, politicians only fund, and I'll give another example in a minute, Lisa, only fund domestic violence policy or social welfare issues, in Australia at least, for one or two political cycles. So when this domestic violence thing blew up in the politician's face a couple of weeks after I gave them a roasting on TV, the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, came out and gave $900 million to domestic violence. And I read his press release, Australian dollars, and I read his press release. and I read the transcript of the interview he also had with a journalist. And in the press release and in speaking to the journalist, he was talking about generational change. But the money was only allocated for 5 years. There can be no generational change in men's behaviour in 5 years.
No.
A generation is 20 years. Why was it 5 years? Because we go to the election in Australia probably in about a year. So that funding will take it to the next to that election. Then the next election will be 3 years after that. So that's 5 years away or thereabouts. So the funding will stop in 2 elections' time, where if he wins it, if he looks like he's going to win the election, he can either hold back the money, or if he's not sure, he can say, I'm going to introduce this new domestic violence policy or his money towards domestic violence, purely as a cynical vote to get re-elected. And that's just, everything works on a political cycle, and it's just appalling to think that the governments, would do that. And that's why you never saw either of any of those 3 politicians voluntarily, not even forcefully, but voluntarily say, we got it wrong, I'm sorry. Because if they had said that on national TV, that 30-second or that 10-second clip when they apologise would have been used against them by another political party.
Of course.
So even an apology is tainted with politics. That is just appalling. So I think in relation to addressing what are some of the solutions. So in Australia, and this goes back to politics, ironically. In Australia, women who fled domestic violence would go to a women's refuge, where there were houses in the community which were only basically known to the police and certain women's groups. So the men who perpetrated or committed the crime couldn't go and find the women. So the funding model for these domestic violence refuges was changed a couple of years ago and just called now shelters. And the reason that the funding was changed and the name was changed was because governments wanted to be able, and we're talking about state and territory and the federal governments, wanted the ability to be able to use these safe homes, these refuges, more than just for women, for other social problems. So that means that there now is less room. In fact, Australia has a housing crisis now, literally, where there's just not enough houses and people are living on the street. So all of a sudden we've got people fleeing domestic violence at a crucial time when one woman is murdered every 4 days, and now they've got nowhere to go. So my personal view is that I don't know why the women should have to leave, because it's not their problem. It's the men's problem. It's men that destroy the world. It's men that trash the environment. It's the men that inflict violence throughout centuries. It's rarely ever women. So it's the men that destroy society. So I don't understand why those refuges or shelters are not put aside now for men. So police go and arrest a man for domestic violence. So rather than the women leaving the house, the women and the children stay there, and all the men go to these shelters, all the men, for that general area. So there's an actual change in the way that domestic violence or refuges are used. So that means the woman can stay in the house, that the children can stay there, but the men are then removed, and they're the ones that go to these shelters, not the women. I don't think that should be the case. The other thing is that they should go there, in my view, and I mentioned this, I might have been on the TV a couple of days after that. They should go there for at least men for 6 months, so they can still go out and earn a wage during the day, because they've got to support the family. Well, hopefully support a family. They can still go out and earn a wage, but they come back to this refuge or the shelter, and they actually sit down and they go through anger management, particular issues.
Yes.
Now, there's nothing to say that it might change men's behaviour. It might change some, but at least it gives the men an opportunity to vent to someone about whatever the situation may be, and hopefully address that anger management within an environment full of men. Now, when I've spoken to people about this, there's been a couple of good points raised. One is that, well, when you get all these, men together who believe they've been, socially disadvantaged or they've been picked upon, might that create a melting pot for others? I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, it's hypothetical because it doesn't happen. I don't necessarily agree with that because, they can go back to work, they can live a fairly normal life. I don't think that, and they've got a structured and responsible program. I don't know if that would engender or incite more men hating women. So they're my two thoughts off the top of my head as to how to address men's violence. I don't think at all that it's pointless. I think that sometimes with domestic violence, when I've joined the police back in the early 1980s, and I look at the police now, and I've got still lots of friends in the police, the generational change has just been phenomenal. It has just been staggering. From when I joined, it was never about the victim, and it was never about the offender. Actually, it was about looking after your partner, because it had drilled into us domestic violence are one of the most dangerous situations you'll find yourself in, because you could be stabbed. And now, the recruits, even though I don't think they're as well as trained as in Sweden or other Nordic countries, they do get a lot on victimology. They do get a lot on victim care, whereas we didn't get that because that was just a reflection of society. We never got any of that. So I do believe that the police are better situated to deal with the victims of domestic violence now. And I also do believe that, the raising of awareness in society has, also been a good thing, probably because it's been called out more throughout society. I've probably spoken to about, since that TV program, 1,000 school children, so probably between the ages of 16 to about probably 19 through in and around Sydney. And, when they ask me questions, both male and female, when they ask me questions, the questions are really, really good. Like they're not surface level questions, they're questions that have significant thought put to them. And, I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that there are really good, boys out there who tomorrow hopefully will stand up for women. But my fear, as an also looking at the other side of the coin, is that we don't want to demonise all men. After my Q&A on TV appearance, I got 660 emails from all around the world. And I would say a quarter of them were from men all around the world saying, great job, fully supported. So the thing is, we don't want to demonise all the good men. The next step is, how do we get these good men to come into the conversation about women and domestic violence? How do we get men to encourage other men to come in and talk about it? Now, for some women, it's going to seem somewhat counterintuitive that here, historically, we have men involved in domestic violence, and now you want us to turn around and invite men into the conversation about domestic violence? I don't, and I'm not talking about obviously offenders. I'm just talking about people in society or men in society who, how do we encourage that? How do we bring them into the conversation? Because men are more than half the problem.
Of course.
So I don't want to demonise all men, but trying to bring them into the conversation, which goes against the grain, which may go against the grain of some women's groups, is going to be a challenge.
What is your thoughts about the incels?
About what, sorry?
Incels. You know the group incels, INCELS. These are young men who hate women.
Yeah, I know a little bit. I don't know a great deal about them, but I think there's always going to be an element in society, tragically, throughout history, who, for whatever reason, are going to be drawn to these extreme organisations. And I think that is just, and that's what jail's there for. And, you know, if it's not these men, it would be other men, you know, perpetrating other types of crime.
Yes.
Now, that's certainly not to you know, that's no excuse at all. But social media is not my area of expertise at all.
Okay.
But I certainly believe that most social media is feeding into this, as
yes.
you know, it's quite common knowledge. But you know, I do believe there are certain people in community, men who are just bad, full stop. That no matter what society did to try and to change them, they're never going to be changed. And these individuals are examples of that. And, you know, they should be placed on a similar terrorism list and, you know, be prosecuted as such because of their extreme and their violent behaviour. You know, it's foreign to me as an individual how someone could be so driven to join an organisation like that. It's just beyond my comprehension, because that wasn't the environment in which I was raised. It could be that, and this is certainly not making an excuse for them, it could well be that, you know, they are individuals who had these views. They may not have been as amplified as they are now, but they were gravitated towards each other, and now they've found, you know, a common cause, for example. It's not a rightful one, certainly not a moral one, but how you address them, I just think there are some people in society that you're just never going to change, which is just absolutely tragic for the victims, for the victims and society generally. Even if you called these individuals out, even if you called them out, it's not going to change their behaviour at all. So when we go back to those, you know, motivating reasons for crime, and we talk about political ideology, this would be an example of an ideology that they are so much wedded to it, that they believe in it so much that no matter what was said, like neo-Nazis, for example, you're never going to change their view. And hopefully they'll, you know, tragically, and that's what society, and that's what jail's for.
Can you think about anything you want to add to our conversation that you, or what you have talked about? Is there anything that comes to mind that you think is this is a message I want to send out clear, where it doesn't matter to who it is? Politicians.
Good question, Lisa. I think that when I look back over you know, I'm in my 60s now, but when I joined the police and look now, as I said earlier, there's been a massive generational change, and I think that change has been very glacial, that we don't realise actually how far we have come in that period of time, not only police but in society. You know, in society, you know, domestic violence was hidden. It's not to say it's not now, but I think it's far more spoken about now than certainly what it was when I was growing up. And I was lucky. I came from parents. I got 4 other brothers, no sisters, and, you know, parents who were just, you know, had a fantastic moral compass and were married for 55 years before Dad was the first one to die. So I think that we have come a long way. And going back to your earlier point about talking about briefly about the US and Kamala Harris, when of those 660 emails I got, one was from a woman in Washington State who has a grant from the Department of Justice, and she's a civilian, and she got the grant to train police in Washington State about their attitudes towards investigating domestic violence. And she said to me, and I Zoom her every couple of weeks, and she told me about a fortnight ago when we were talking about this topic about police attitudes towards domestic violence, that when she talks to the police about stalking, she says a common reply or comment to that is that, well, the woman should feel flattered.
Oh, gosh.
Now, yeah, I know. And then, so I thought to myself, you know, I would hate to think that any you know, average punter on the street, or certainly any law enforcement officer in Australia would think that. I would hate to think that they still had that attitude. And I know that the police that I know, none of them have that attitude. So, you know, I think we've come a long way. I don't think we'll ever, eradicate it because there's not that government backing. But any idea is a good idea. But I certainly don't, as much as I've been in this area now for decades and as passionate as I am about it, I always see a positive future. I think that if one male behaviour can change, then hopefully, that can be amplified by his effect on a couple of other males. So I don't see it as a gloomy thing at all. It's a tragic thing. But, I do see a better future, for I hope, a better future for society and a better understanding by men about their management of anger. But unfortunately, the women are the ones that suffer and the children are the ones that suffer, and they're the ones that put out more so than the male. That's one thing actually I will ask before I go, Lisa, is that do you have apprehended domestic violence orders?
Okay, so apprehended violence orders meaning what?
So if the police go to a domestic violence matter, the police can take out on behalf of the victim an order putting conditions on the offender's behaviour. So that could be that they're not to go back home, they're to reside somewhere else. They're not to go within, say, 300 metres of the woman. They're not allowed to ring them. They're not allowed to text them. So it's like a court order that dictates the behaviour to the offender.
And I wish I could be honest and give you an honest answer. I'm not this is not my area, but Vince, I would imagine so, but I'm going to have to come back with that response to you. I would hate to have Swedish, police officers coming back to me. What do you mean you're responding to questions that you know nothing about?
Sorry, I shouldn't have asked a question. I should have just made a statement.
Yeah, you should have just made a statement. But look, it's a good question, and I'm all for finding out things. So
actually, just cut that from the podcast. You'll be fine.
No, I'm going to keep that because now you put me on the spot. And this is what I like to, hey, this is part of my responsibility. You have a podcast and you put something out there, you have to be responsible. Thank you so much, Vince, for your time, your generosity, sharing your experiences and valuable advice. And of course, I would like to be in contact with you, invite you back again for another conversation in the future, if it is okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine. Look, it's been a pleasure, and I would love to visit the Nordic countries. I just went last week actually to the Sydney Swedish Film Festival, and every time I go every couple of years when it's on. So I just I don't know whether it's a romantic notion I have of Sweden and other Nordic countries, but I just think it's a wonderful place. But I really appreciate the opportunity, Lisa. Thanks so much.
And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt är livet i Sverige, or in English, That's Life here in Sweden, with me, Lisa Åsimäki. Till next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.